I am very excited to introduce Daniel Pearlstein as this week's cloaking speaker. Daniel is currently the Policy and Communication Director at the Riders Alliance, New York City's grassroots organization of public transit riders. The group builds power and community to win better, faster, more frequent, reliable, accessible, affordable buses, trains, and paratransit service across the city. He joined as a member in 2014 and started full-time in 2017 after working as a New York City Council staffer. Daniel holds a bachelor's in biology and society and master's of city and regional planning, both from Cornell University, as well as a law degree from Yeshiva University. Daniel's transit advocacy extends all the way back to his time at Cornell, where he helped successfully negotiate free TCAT passes for new Cornell students. But I'll let him tell the full story. Please join me in welcoming Daniel.
Thank you. This is great. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Yes, it's on. Great. Good afternoon. My name is Danny Pearlstein. I'm the Policy and Communications Director at the Riders Alliance. I want to thank Sam and everybody here so much for bringing me back to Cornell. As Sam mentioned, I was here for a very long time, 6 years, approximately 20, 25 years ago. And although I've been back very occasionally since, briefly, it was this trip yesterday when I got off the bus and came up the hill that I was hit with the immense wave of nostalgia that I had not at all anticipated. And finding a memory under every rock has been totally crazy. So it's great to do that under these auspices because I'm really excited to talk to you all about what we do at Riders Alliance and what and how we won congestion relief. But first, let me get a sense of sort of who's here, who is a regular public transit rider, or who has been a regular public transit rider over the life course. Great. And who has spent what you would consider a substantial amount of time in New York City. Okay. All right. Very good. So, I'm except for the 6 years I spent here and a lot of time that ends up I spend where my wife's family is in the Adirondacks, I have spent my entire life in New York City. And although I lived away and now I'm back, I'm once again a very parochial New Yorker, and the work that we do is very parochial. We organize grassroots power at New York City subway stations and bus stops. We don't even do it in all 5 boroughs. We really only do it in the 4 boroughs that have a subway system. And the reason we do it is because our theory is that grassroots power is the route to better public transit, and that better public transit in turn fuels the lively, fair, just city that gives rise to more grassroots power and a participatory democracy. And that without that, we're isolated from one another. Incidentally, in New York, without that, nothing works. But with it, something special could happen. And the route to congestion relief is sort of the route through the last 15 years that we've existed, right? Because we've only been around a little over a dozen years, and also the last 15 years of the New York City subway, which has been through some challenges. We had the fortune to start off in 2012 when subway delays were about 20,000 a month. There were about 20,000 trains a month that arrived at their destination more than 6 minutes late. But by January 2018, it was 76,000 a month. So it wasn't our fault, but somehow in our first 6 years, subway delays quadrupled. And now they've come down a lot, and we don't take the blame, we don't take all the credit, but what we do take credit for is building the grassroots power required to fund the fixes to the subway that congestion relief represents. So I just briefly, this is sort of how we look at our most powerful when we're outside with a lot of folks, when we're inside with the governor, in this case, in the lower right, or we're in the lower left when we're in front of a courthouse, where not 6 months after that photo was taken, we were suing the governor in that courthouse. And now we're in a better place, and we and the governor are together suing in the big courthouse behind that one that you can see poking up from behind 60 Center Street. But at the top is sort of where we're most typical. So we were in front of the governor's New York City office in the top left, and then these 2 photos to the right, we're in what is our home away from home, our comfort zone. We call it the Assembly Staircase. It's a staircase tucked away in the New York State Capitol. All the other rallies are on the $1 million staircase. Ours is tucked just outside the Assembly chamber because there are 150 Assembly members in Albany, and we want them all to see what we're up to. We want to fund the MTA. We want more trains. We need better buses. And at the time, the MTA was run by Andrew Cuomo, the former governor of New York, now running for mayor. And what we were about for several years, and now we have it, and it's here, is congestion pricing now. So let's talk about that. Congestion pricing was passed into law way back in 2019. And so we spent the several years before that building power with riders. We started out in a few neighborhoods in Brooklyn, organizing riders on the C train in Bed-Stuy, the G train in Clinton Hill, and the R train in Bay Ridge, because those were notoriously slow and unreliable local train services. And our board chair is now a G train rider who we met, way back then. One of our closest allies in the New York State Senate is an R train rider we met, in Bay Ridge way back when. So this carries through. My colleague Dana, actually, who is standing between my boss Betsy and Governor Kathy Hochul, she was a C train rider who we met in Bed-Stuy way back when. But congestion pricing, passed by the legislature in 2019, creates a cordon toll. It's the first congestion relief cordon toll in the United States. It's similar to what they have in Stockholm and London and Singapore. And the revenue from it, we're now looking at, probably $600 million this year, the first year. 80% of that is going to modernize subways and buses, to the MTA capital program. It's lockboxed by law. It must go into MTA capital upgrades, which are things that cost a lot of money and last a long time. 10% to the Long Island Railroad, 10% to Metro North. It could have been 10% to New Jersey Transit, but New Jersey wouldn't come to the negotiating table and decided to lose their lawsuit. Congestion pricing has benefits, though, for the entire region. The biggest beneficiaries of congestion pricing are people who drive from New Jersey through the Holland Tunnel, where congestion has decreased 48%. Reduced traffic in and around the Central Business District. And again, the Holland Tunnel is the biggest beneficiary, Lincoln Tunnel, Brooklyn Bridge. Within the Central Business District, though, there are still a lot of for-hire vehicle trips. And so there's much less total congestion reduction in there because you have a lot of cars driving around. But hundreds of millions of dollars to fix the subway, better air quality. The definitive data will be out in January, but all the preliminary data look good. Better access to opportunity, faster buses, more reliable subways, reduced travel times. This is still a live controversy, right? We are in federal court now. The Trump administration does not want congestion pricing for various reasons, articulated and not articulated, articulate and inarticulate. They allege this sort of, vast demand of working people to drive to work in Manhattan. But in fact, here are the statistics. 85% of people take the transit into work before congestion pricing. So now it's probably closer to 90%. There's some mode shift. 11% drive. Most people coming in from New Jersey, where the biggest ruckus was raised on a bipartisan basis, and still from the governor of New Jersey, who's a Democrat, 90% are coming in from Jersey on New Jersey Transit, which, this came up in our dinner conversation last night. New Jersey Transit is bad. It is really, really bad, and yet it is the third largest commuter railroad in the United States. It is essential to the economy of New Jersey. There is an incomparable amount of investment going on by New York compared to what New Jersey is doing, and we need to fix that, but we are not yet the Riders Alliance of New Jersey. So who's driving around? And I made this point earlier because the congestion benefit is biggest at the entrances to the zone and less so in the zone itself, and that's because of that large number of for-hire vehicles and taxis, which are paying multiple per-trip congestion charges. So there was a big myth. They don't pay. They do pay. They don't pay a lot. Maybe they don't pay enough, but they do pay. Cars and motorcycles are paying. The fee on cars is $9. So when the governor paused the program, and we'll get to this, the governor paused the program, she also knocked down the fee from what it was at 15 down to 9. It'll go back up to 15 by 2031. Trucks and buses. Trucks, I just want to call out, trucks are essential, right? No one wants to drive a truck in Midtown Manhattan unless you absolutely have to. This is borne out by what's happened since congestion relief, is there weren't just a ton of people driving through for fun who are now going around. No, all the trucks that are there are still going there because they need to, and they need to move goods there. There's no freight rail to move goods there. And buses, right? A large number of people are coming into Manhattan by bus, even though we have a very well-known subway. It doesn't reach everywhere. Environmental justice mitigation. So, folks are familiar with the National Environmental Policy Act. At the state, we have State Environmental Quality Review Act, but congestion pricing, it was passed in 2019. It needed to go through a NEPA review for the federal government to permit it to take place. So we now have agreement with the federal government. We made it at the last second under the Biden administration. This is part of the fight with the Trump administration. And it's a discretionary decision of the federal government to permit the tolling of federal aid highways, right? The reason the federal government spends $250 billion a year on highways is so we don't have to pay again for them. And these aren't really highways, but the New York City street grid and bridges surrounding have received some federal money. And so we had to go through this federal review. It was painstaking, it took years, and it involved a lot of studies of what might happen. Those studies have been disproven, right? The studies showed there was going to be a lot of diversion of car and truck traffic through the Bronx, worsening environmental justice hazards in the borough that Robert Moses, devastated with highways. None of that has happened. These models were garbage. We should not have used them. It's a joke. It's ridiculous. The consultants should be disqualified. But on the upside, there's hundreds of millions of dollars to mitigate, but again, to improve on environmental harms in the Bronx. And so there's going to be big air quality improvements, primarily thanks to money from congestion pricing that will pay to upgrade the Hunts Point terminal market, where food for 20 million people gets driven in big trucks, which is a planning issue of its own, and often then sits in big trucks with huge diesel engines running their refrigerator units. Those will be electrified, thanks to congestion pricing. It's going to be a huge benefit in the Bronx. There's some other details, and we can go through that. But again, the harm didn't come to pass. The benefits will come to pass. And so just again, I'm very sort of linear. When we do this, we run campaigns. We have to think in terms of the timeline. The timeline here got sprawled beyond, I think, what people would imagine. The law passed Albany in 2019, and this is something people have been proposing since the 50s, right? Columbia economist William Vickery, he first proposed a congestion charge for the subway. He proposed it would have been, other systems have this peak and off-peak fares. We don't have that. We don't really have the capacity to even collect those, but that's how it started off, and then it quickly became congestion pricing. It was proposed by Mayor Lindsay. It was most recently proposed by Mayor Bloomberg in 2007 as part of Plan YC. It didn't pass the legislature then. The big difference was grassroots power and the fact that the subway had begun to fall apart. And there was really some urgent need to pay for it, but he didn't have a movement. He had his wallet. He spent $1 million paying Republicans in the state Senate to support it. He couldn't get it through the Democratic-run assembly. We did. Federal Highway approved the environmental review more than 4 years later. The first Trump administration just sat on it for 20 months. They didn't rule, they didn't say anything. It just sat on somebody's desk. That somebody was the general counsel. He is now back as the Deputy U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Stephen Bradbury, also famous for writing the torture memos in the Bush administration. Governor Hochul, though, within a year got cold feet. The governor was very perceptive, right? I think people didn't realize, and I'm defending her here, but I don't defend her decision, I defend her rationale, which is that in June 2024, it really started earlier. The tea leaves were there. When we look back, the governor got cold feet. She was worried about affordability and the role that prices would play in the 2024 election. She was exactly right about that. What she was wrong about, though, was that very few people were going to pay this one price. And, obviously, it's grandiose to make this claim, but now that congestion pricing is working, it's a bright, shining example of a public policy success, right? Government working effectively for the people with very few downsides, right? I don't think this would have turned the election around beforehand had it happened. It wouldn't have, news wouldn't have spread. It doesn't matter to enough people. But it's true that affordability was a huge issue, and it's true that congestion pricing is working now, and the governor is one among many, many, many New Yorkers who said, gee, it's working pretty well. I didn't expect that, right? And so, we were sort of these, kind of true believers. Our belief was borne out, but there were tons and tons and tons of skeptics, people who, they believe economics, they believe, physics, but when they put it all together, they thought, somehow this will go wrong. Somehow all the congestion will remain, and yet somehow we won't collect the money. So we will have the worst of all worlds. It's not what happened. So we sued her. We sued her before the election. We sued her in state court because the Traffic Mobility Act says the governor shall implement a congestion pricing program, not may. And that kicked around for a while. We had lawyers, though, with us from the climate movement. We were represented by Earth Justice. Our fellow plaintiffs were the Sierra Club, which Earth Justice used to be a part of as the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, and the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. And they wanted to test New York's path-breaking climate law, also from 2019, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, because the state is dragging its heels on that significantly still today, and they wanted to win a ruling that said that stopping congestion pricing is contrary to our climate law, which essentially says we have to go forward and not back. And if we go back, if we do things that are contrary to what we know is good for reducing emissions, we have to rigorously study that, and we didn't do it. But we never got a decision in the case because we settled, because after the November election, the governor very quickly decided she wanted to turn it on at a lower price for various reasons. And a lot of that had to do with the incoming Trump administration. I think if Kamala Harris were the president, the governor might have said, we have time to get this right, we can tweak it, we can do more stuff with it. We might still not know today that it works. But again, an unfortunate silver lining is we have congestion pricing now. So we turned it on. There was last-minute appeals by the state of New Jersey in Philadelphia that lost, and on a very, very cold night in January, I made my child and various other people made their children stand by while the head of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority unveiled the sign, and you could see that the number on it had been corrected from $15 to read $9. But it's here. And then, so it turned on in January. In February, USDOT started sending a series of increasingly threatening letters. You must turn it off or else. And we got a preliminary injunction, no more or else's, in May. We're waiting on a permanent injunction. And what's interesting is that we all thought we would have it by now. The same judge had been ruling in our favor in many different cases for a long time, right? There were many suits to stop it before it happened. This is a suit that was initiated by New York and us to stop it from stopping. But we have no decision from the judge, and no news is good news. Honestly, the program is working. As the governor likes to say, the cameras are staying on. So 1 million fewer vehicles had entered since the program launched. That is out of date. It's now more than that. The travel times 10 to 30%. I've seen 48% for the Holland Tunnel. Bus riders are getting faster bus service. Weekend express bus ridership is up. So this is inducing mode shift, right? More people were probably driving in on the weekend because there was less traffic, but now they have to pay, and so they're not. Subway ridership is up. Subway ridership is at 4.5 million a day. It was at 5.5 million a day before the pandemic. So we are the vast majority back to our previous ridership, which is good. And transit systems around the country are really struggling. We will struggle again. We're not struggling now, and we're grateful for that. And the program got a lot more popular. The people who like it the most are the drivers who are saving time. Drivers who don't drive into the zone like it the least because they anticipate how angry they would be if they had to pay the toll. But those who actually pay the toll and experience the time savings, which wasn't available at any price beforehand, they enjoy it. Manhattan residents overwhelmingly enjoy it. It's a strong majority. And Brooklynites too. The people who pay for it like it. And I don't have to go through this, but the Times did a fun piece in the Upshot, New York Times, in June, and this is the MTA put this up there. What had changed since the toll began? That there are fewer cars in the street, traffic's moving faster, commute times are down, all the good stuff. I guess it was too soon to say on the pollution. And it's funny, they put public opinion not great but improving. And so there was this real delta. Is that the program was polling 2 to 1 against before it started, and now it hasn't been polled in a while because it's not a live issue, which is interesting. But when they stopped polling it, it was polling about even. And some of the polls were of people who would never pay the toll. I mean, there was a notorious poll that the governor responded to with the pause, where it was 63% against. But of those polled, 44% never traveled to Manhattan by any means, and it was a statewide poll. If the governor's sensitive to statewide polls, she's the governor of the whole state, but still, it doesn't matter a lot if somebody in Ithaca who doesn't drive to Manhattan, how they feel about congestion relief. Right? We're seeing this again in our mayor's race, how they feel about who's the mayor of New York City. That matters more for our politics. This really doesn't matter at all for our politics. It matters for people's time and people's money. Right? It is something that people perceive on a material level, which is, I think, something that we could talk about more, is that this policy, it's not big and flashy. It was very controversial because it's seen as anti-car, but actually it helps people drive their cars faster into a congested area. It's not anti-car, it's anti-traffic congestion. And so we wanted to switch gears. I was saying that when I walked by this room last night, there was a picture of this man who many people will recognize. In that corner of the screen, that's of course Zohran Mamdani, the Democratic nominee for New York City mayor, who we've worked very closely with. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and about what's to come. We met Zohran almost exactly 3 years ago. I met him on Zoom. He was an assemblyman. He had been in office for a couple of years. And it was a shocking experience, a little bit like my return to campus yesterday. And we were meeting with him, this is a dissent. It was, I've met a lot of elected officials. I worked for a lot of elected officials. He's a cut above, right? I mean, the reason he's able to connect with New Yorkers of a great variety of stripes and, on a lot of different issues and get people to believe something that people didn't believe was possible is, a testament to his abilities, right? He is an incredibly, incredibly talented person. Very strong policy talent as well as, interpersonal charisma. It's both, right? He was able to really delve into the intricacies of transit policy, from the get-go. He did his homework before meeting with us. And, we met him at a time when the MTA was on the ropes, right? Congestion pricing was nowhere in sight. It was in the bureaucratic morass of the Biden administration. And transit ridership was a couple million below pre-COVID. And the federal pandemic aid, which replaced the fare revenue and kept the buses and trains running at the same frequency, was running out. We got the most aid, but we ran out of it the fastest because of how much we spend. The MTA, and this is important for scale, the MTA has a $20 billion annual operating budget. And that includes debt service, but it doesn't include new capital spending, which is another 10 or $15 billion on top of that. Right? The MTA has 80,000 employees. It is enormous. It moves now 7 million trips every day. And so we worked with Zohran on winning the first tranche of state MTA bailout funds, essentially, post-COVID. So, which was a hike in what's called the payroll mobility tax, which is a tax on corporate and business payrolls in the downstate region of New York. And so that's been hiked again since to pay for capital upgrades. But at the time it was for operating upgrades. And so we worked with him on that. It was called the Fix the MTA package. We worked with him again on the run-up to congestion pricing to win more frequent bus service, and the state implemented more frequent service on a few dozen bus routes to help sort of assuage some of those concerns about people in especially bus-dependent parts of the city who otherwise would drive, who don't have good subway access. But right now what's most exciting is he's run on this campaign of fast and free buses. And whatever we think about free buses, I think everybody who wants a faster bus, at least everyone who likes transit or who rides a bus. And he injected the concept of transit into the mayor's race for the first time in a very long time, right? We had our current mayor, Eric Adams, ran on reducing crime. Our previous mayor, Bill de Blasio, ran on improving education. Michael Bloomberg, way back, ran on bringing a corporate style of management into city government. But Zohran is running on fast and free buses, free childcare, and freeze the rent. So this is big, not just because it's transit, but in New York, it's the bus. We have a subway that moves 4.5 million people every day. We have a bus that moves 1.5 million. But we have the slowest buses in the United States, the biggest bus ridership and the slowest buses. Again, we have the most congestion. But now that's become visible. As organizers, we started on the subway. We've done a lot of organizing on the subway, but we've done a lot on the bus. And honestly, we have less to show for it. It's a lot harder to get more space on the street to prioritize bus service than it is to get more money in the budget to pay to upgrade the New York City subway. But we believe, making progress. So this has been in the media, and the next big step is that there are some bus projects on hold in the Adams administration. There were projects that the City Department of Transportation was working on major bus routes that they got to the precipice of implementation, and then City Hall called and said to stop because they got some political objection. He's promised to get those moving again. We hope to see that in the next several months. And the bigger promise is the streets plan. So New York City also in 2019 passed a streets plan law, which requires essentially that we build 30 miles of bus lanes every year, among other things. And we haven't come close to that since the law was passed. But we're optimistic that not only will we come close to it, but just the opportunity to do a streets plan, the second one is due at the end of 26. To do that plan, will be a good opportunity for the new administration to, whoever it is, but assuming it's either way, to do a plan that really ups the ante for bus riders, because the expectations have been, I think, reasonably, raised quite a bit. And whether we will see our first bus rapid transit routes or what else, we'll see. Most bus rapid transit is in cities that don't have a big subway, but we have slightly less than half New York City, 3 or 4 million people who don't have good subway access at home. And so we have a lot of room to improve transit service even within New York City, and that is overwhelmingly a matter of better buses because new subways are not realistically on the horizon. So why don't I pause there, and why don't we take some questions, take some back and forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, congratulations on the success so far. And a lot of challenges ahead, but questions?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a first-year undergraduate studying government, and I absolutely support congestion pricing, but I also hear a common argument against it being the fact that it kind of indiscriminately affects people with a lower income because it's not responsive to the amount someone makes. So what would your argument, or what would you say to someone who is upset that wealthier people with a higher income are less affected by this issue?
In New York City, virtually no low-income people drive into Manhattan because the base cost in vehicle ownership and wear and tear and fuel and insurance and parking is already very high. People driving to work in Manhattan are already paying a lot more than a $9 toll. $9 is incremental, it's not exponential. And I think it's important to point out that New York, as much as there is a cost of living crisis and we need an affordable city and rents are sky high and childcare is unbelievable, transit is not. And so New Yorkers pay, on average, the lowest transportation costs of residents of any U.S. city, and that's just because of how effective and extensive our transit network is. And so, a driver might be paying $15,000 a year, give or take, expense-wise on a car. There's plenty of people who use transit $1,500 a year. So I think there was one study by the Community Service Society, which is an anti-poverty group that dates back to the 19th century, and they said, for every low-income driver into Manhattan, there's 50 low-income workers who would benefit from congestion pricing.
Hi, my name is Veronica. I'm a first-year MRP student and a little skeptical of congestion pricing. So I just wanted to ask, what kind of pushback do you guys receive from taxi services like Uber and Lyft? And then with the increase or the implementation of free buses, what is the strategy of making them fast? Because with the implementation of free, more people are going to be using it, which could increase crowding on buses. So I just wanted to have an explanation of that.
Well, let me ask you, is your skepticism rooted in taxi concerns, or are there other concerns? First, let's take that one first.
I've lived in New York City my whole life. My parents drive. They pay the tolls. We also walk and use the train. And I've used Uber and the MTA. I just feel like it's maybe not the most effective, in my personal opinion, but yeah.
So let me start there. So it's a blunt tool, right? It's not the pricing, there are different prices, but there's not dynamic pricing, right? If there were dynamic pricing, it would cost more to drive into the city in December than in January, because there's a lot more people driving in for the holidays than right after the holidays. So we don't yet have that. I think that's, there's no surge pricing, I guess, like Uber and Lyft. So that's one thought. And the other thought we have, we had this even from some people who were longtime champions of congestion pricing, is they don't like this particular policy. One of the things that happen, I think this is true generally when you work on policy, is that some of the strongest supporters of the policy on the whole won't like the execution of the policy because they know it so well, they have a better idea, they have a different idea, and so the one that happens is the one that's the product of legislative compromise. It isn't necessarily the product of individual brilliance or even collective brilliance. This is the one we got, and we have the opportunity to improve on it. Everywhere else it's been done, it's been changed, and I think we will see that here. We can't change it at all right now because it's brand new and it's under scrutiny by the federal government and the federal courts. But we already know, for example, that the prices will rise in 28 to $12 and 31 to $15. Uber and Lyft is an interesting case. So Uber and Lyft love congestion pricing. They love it because it encourages other people to keep their cars at home. And so that means they have the run of the street. But they also have very strong preferences for how it's implemented, and they've spent tons of money to execute their preferences so that the per trip charge for a 4-hour vehicle is only X, not X plus 2. And there is a lot of criticism from people who don't like Uber and Lyft of congestion pricing, that it is a corrupt that there was a corrupt process that brought it about. And what I will say is that we have a lot of stakeholders, right? We have our member leaders. And I can talk about what it's like building grassroots power and having member volunteers and member leaders. And we also have donors, right? I have a full-time job. I was a member, but now this is my job, and I get paid to do this, and we have a staff of 12 people. We have a variety of funding sources. We don't take a dime from Uber and Lyft. We've talked to them extensively about the policy that they've supported. We don't take a dime from them because they tell their investors that they are competing with public transit, and that for us is a bridge too far. So that's one. The third piece on Fast and Free. So there was a free bus pilot when we worked with Mamdani in 2023 to pass the Fix the MTA budget, and we got all this money for keeping the subways and buses running and for improving the frequency of subway service, which is my personal favorite victory, is that the subway's now running more frequently on 14 lines post-pandemic than pre-pandemic, which is unique. He also won, what has become very well known, which is this free bus pilot. And so the big takeaways from the free bus pilot, where they did one route in each borough, just 5 routes, was that they got a big jump in ridership. They got a big decrease in, basically assaults on bus operators. But what they didn't see was an increase in speeds because of the big increase in ridership. And so the expectation is if you had free buses more broadly, you wouldn't have people coming over from adjacent routes and crowding your route. But I do think that, and this is why fast and free is important, and why we don't just say we're going to get a speed improvement from stopping collecting fares, right? Fare collection takes time, but so does boarding the bus, so do a lot of other issues. The big reason we believe in bus rapid transit is it incorporates many different measures to improve bus service. But eliminating fare collection, is one, and I think it would play more of a role in speeding up the bus. And the Times is actually about to report on this in the next couple of days in the Upshot column, so you should look out for that. But yeah, I think that the big difference between the pilot and a geographical expansion would be proportionate increase in ridership.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Hannah. I'm a sophomore in Urban and Regional Studies. There's a handful of us in here in Nick Klein's Planning for Sustainable Transportation, and he said he didn't want us to leave without asking you about how you made or how you influenced the TCAT being free for some students. So could you tell us that story?
Sure. So when I was a student here, I lived at 660 Stewart Avenue, which is a university-owned cooperative house dating from the 19th century. It's next to the Cahen Center for Southeast Asian Studies. If you know it, it's behind some fraternities. It's set back from Stewart Avenue. And at the time that I lived there, there was not a parking lot behind the house. And so we fought very aggressively. It was a literal not in my backyard. It was my backyard. Not in my backyard. We fought them tooth and nail. I was arrested in Day Hall in the president's office. There were 100 people arrested in the woods behind the house. It went on for 3 years, and then we lost and they built the parking lot. But one of the things we were able to do was negotiate a community benefits agreement, and the bus passes are the signal community benefit. There were other benefits, I can't name them, but the bus passes were a big one, and it's funny now to be tangentially at least working on free buses in New York City, having really come full circle in an unexpected way.
Yes. Good afternoon, Danny. Thank you for your amazing presentation. My name is Mohammed. I'm also a first-year MRP student who's been a lifelong New Yorker and native of Queens. While I do think that congestion pricing, I'm a huge advocate for it, but however, the way it's been implemented, personally, I dislike. So I think there could be major improvements that can be made to congestion pricing in the future. So what are some of future changes that you could see in congestion pricing? And how do you think that you can implement not only for low-income people that live in the outer boroughs, but low-income taxi drivers themselves? So Queens has a very diverse population of taxi drivers from that background who commute to Manhattan Central Business District for their work, and they're paying the $9 congestion toll every day. So how do you think in the future they would change that, or maybe consider reducing their cost?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think that in the law itself, there's a provision for 25% surge pricing. I would really like to see that on days like the UN General Assembly is meeting in Midtown, or the city Department of Transportation designates like a few dozen gridlock days every year. If those are gridlock days, then we should actually be trying to cut gridlock, not just like begging people to stay home or take the train. We have an incentive now. We should be using that, right? Under the existing program that the governor has authorized, we can't do that yet. I'd like to see that. One of the interesting things that came out of and this goes back to the question from Veronica over here. So Uber and Lyft lobby a lot, right? One of the things they lobbied for, as far as I know, is they lobbied to get for-hire vehicle drivers designated an environmental justice community, which is surprising, right? Because that's usually a geographical designation, not an occupational designation. So they did that. And so as a result, the MTA had to study the impact of congestion pricing on for-hire drivers. And they said, some of them are going to have to pay. The industry might consolidate even further, and some people might stop driving. But one of the suggestions that they made was that some taxi and for-hire vehicle drivers might become MTA bus drivers, right? That the bus ridership would grow. This is even before Fast and Free buses. Bus ridership would grow. We would need more bus drivers. Why not? And the response from organized groups of taxi drivers was fierce. How dare you tell us to drive a bus? Meanwhile, it's the same group of people saying, like, we are so devastated by changes in our industry and regulation and competition, like, you're killing us. Well, they can't both be true, right? Driving a bus is a civil service position that is honorable. It comes with a salary and benefits. It's clearly attracting a different population than driving a taxi, which is seen as entrepreneurial. But there's a dilemma there, right? There's an inconsistency there. My gloss on it, as somebody who rides a bus and organizes with bus riders, is that some people feel like it's more of an honor to drive rich people around than to drive bus riders around. I don't think that's fair. I think there's some sort of class tension there, too. But at the end of the day, I think you're right, which is that how we do this is a little bit ad hoc, right? Taxis and Ubers and Lyfts are in some ways getting a pass because they can make multiple trips in and out of the zone, and they're paying only a low per fare fee. It's a few dollars per fare. But right, when they are not driving a fare and they're just driving themselves to work, they're paying like everybody else. And I think there's certainly an opportunity potentially to leave the car inside the zone and not pay to come in, and to take the train home. But otherwise, right, we haven't satisfied that demand. And when it comes time to revisit the program, I'm sure that'll be something that'll have to be prioritized among many other concerns.
Thank you.
Hi, Danny. Hi.
Oh, hey,
Sorry about that.
Go over there.
Yeah, my name is Enoch. I'm a fourth-year city and regional planning student, and I'm a native of Staten Island. I bounce between Staten Island and South Brooklyn. I'm an R train rider as well as an express bus rider, as well as a driver, begrudgingly. My question lies between what you expect to happen for the outer boroughs in terms of improvements with this new flow of capital coming in from congestion pricing, what a resident like me, especially like my parents, who have told me since I've gotten into studying urban planning, why is the Verrazano so expensive? Why do we have to pay a toll to come in and go to work when there are no other options for us to get to where we need to go to make money? What would we expect in terms of that? And also in terms of what would you recommend for someone like me who, doesn't really align with, the Republican politics of Staten Island and has to cope with them when riding the super, super slow buses, a ride that would take 10 minutes via car takes 40 by bus. So no brainer, I choose to drive. What would you expect for someone while organizing or while advocating for bus riders on Staten Island? Thank you.
It's a great question about politics, right? I mean, and why things, right? I mean, a lot of people move to Staten Island to get away from things in other places. And the overwhelming share of the population has moved there since the Verrazano was built in 1964. And so there's always been a toll to get off the island, right? I mean, you move there, you kind of factor that in, and it's factored into real estate prices. Honestly, real estate prices would be higher on the island if there were no bridge tolls. But there is a free ferry, right? You know, we joke, we have free transit in New York City. It's a Staten Island ferry, and it was made free by a Republican, Rudy Giuliani, when he was the mayor, to thank the people of Staten Island for voting him into office. So things like that can happen. They did happen. They do happen. You know, we were joking, well, what could you offer Staten Island now? What are you going to pay people to take the ferry? But I think, you know, more broadly, the challenge you're talking about, I think, is about density. That it's hard to sustain a fast, frequent, and reliable bus when people are living at the scale people are living at on Staten Island, because Staten Island buses are already the most heavily subsidized buses in the city because the ridership is just lower. You know, when the bus I ride on Fordham Road is insane. It's much more crowded than most subways. It is the Cross Bronx Expressway if you don't have a car in the Bronx, which is more than half the people in the Bronx. Everybody's on it. It's packed, you know, noon to midnight. And so, you know, I think this is a transit land use nexus question, which is, what would it look like to have more people living on Staten Island? And you know, consequentially more people working on Staten Island too, and fewer people having to travel to work off the island for high-paying jobs. All those things can happen, but Staten Island would be less suburban-like, and it would have more of the urban features that some people moved away from.
Hello, thank you for your talk. My name is Sophia. I'm a third-year undergraduate student in URS, and I know you mentioned that there was a lot of strong bipartisan opposition coming from New Jersey and that NJ Transit didn't even come to the table. And I was wondering if, as you're seeing the positive effects of the implementation of congestion pricing, if you've noticed any change at all in that opposition, if opinion is changing at all.
So the loudest guy in New Jersey came in fourth place in the Democratic primary for governor, Josh Gottheimer. So he was not able to ride that into Trenton. The winner of the primary, who will likely win the general, Micah Sherrill, she is a quieter opponent of congestion pricing, right? And you know, her district in Congress is also, there's a lot of, you know, very suburban and exurban rural parts of her district. Like, she was responding to that. I think, you know, the one candidate in the primary who was very favorable to congestion pricing was Steve Fulop, the mayor of Jersey City, who just took a job in New York. so he has left. But no, I think that once Murphy is out of Trenton and Sherrill is in, I think we're just not going to hear very much about that for a while. What I think is frustrating probably to advocates, especially advocates who were very close to Fulop and also, you know, excited about Mayor Baraka, is that, you know, Sherrill has more of a suburban base, and there's just this failure to acknowledge the importance of transit to that base, right? You know, my aunt was she lived in Sherrill's district for decades, you know, before she was a congresswoman, and she commuted in to the city, and she just had horrendous commutes, you know, for decades. It was such a nice community, but it was so unfortunate to have such a bad commute she lived closer to Midtown than I do, living at the northern tip of Manhattan. But it was no comparison in terms of travel time or reliability. And so that is another sort of suburban-like dilemma of like, when do you acknowledge, you know, the material reality of people's lives and what people actually need? And when do you level with them and say, fixing New Jersey Transit is going to cost X, and no, I'm not gonna, like, you know, throw a temper tantrum over the 2% of my constituents who are paying this charge.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm the second year MRP student. I read a few criticals about this congestion pricing last semester, so I have two questions. First is about the distribution of the collected fees that compared to the benefits that these financial burdens on individuals are more likely to be seen. So what you do to deal with these concerns about the delayed gratification, or or is the time that's saved it is enough to convince people to do that? And my second question is about another critics that about the administration, this complexity and this interagency coordination. So I'm wondering, like, what have you done to deal with this complexity and to improve or to help to build a better cooperation between this? Okay, thank you.
So let me take your first question, and then I want to see if I get your second question. Otherwise, you can say more about it. Right. So there are upfront benefits of congestion pricing to two groups primarily. People who pay it and are experiencing time savings, and bus riders who don't pay it and are experiencing time savings. As well as, you could argue, we haven't seen this, but I think we'll see it borne out, like better response times for emergency vehicles. So people who need an ambulance, need a fire truck, should be benefiting, probably have already benefited. As well as, and there's other types of benefits, like there have been fewer crashes, which can cause injury and death. There's less noise. There's probably less air pollution. We're all probably breathing a little easier. But there are some benefits, in particular the benefits for our members, that will come at the end, right? Because we fought for the policy primarily to improve the subway, which takes a lot of time. And also, which is subject to this like broad distribution of benefits throughout the entire network, some of which is like right in the congestion zone, some of which is miles and miles away, some of which is in wealthy neighborhoods, some of which is in poor neighborhoods. But it's a system, and this is something we really struggle with when we talk to elected officials who represent small geographies, because the districts in New York City, many of the assembly districts, can be tiny. I live in the smallest congressional district in the United States, which not coincidentally is the most transit-dependent district because it's the densest. So when talking to elected officials, it's hard to say, like, we are going to fix I do this all the time. We're going to fix the signals in Brooklyn. Congestion pricing is on hold, and as a result, we're not fixing any signals in Brooklyn right now. You represent Upper Manhattan. You don't think you care about that, except the reason your train is delayed here is because it hasn't arrived from Brooklyn. Right? It's a system. And the same is true with accessibility, right? Like, the system isn't accessible. 30% or 40% of stations at this point have elevators, but it's not truly accessible because people with mobility impairments want to be able to travel to any station that anyone else can travel to. And so until we get to that point, we haven't really achieved that, but it's a generational project, and adding an elevator in the East Bronx might not matter to you today, but suddenly you find out you need to go there, and it's really important. So the second question is about interagency coordination.
Yeah.
Like, which agencies in particular?
Just like read a few articles about like complaining these interagency cooperation is not like efficient enough in collecting fees and all these like improvements to this these policy, because it's just too much of the stakeholders have different opinions, that kind of stuff.
I mean, I'm curious to hear more. I mean, I can take very broad brush, which is that the MTA is driving this forward. The law mandates the MTA to do this. So the MTA doing it, and obviously the MTA is getting the money and spending the money. But it had to work closely with City DOT, which owns the streets. It had to work with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which they fought about where to put up the cameras because the Port Authority is half controlled by New Jersey. And then there were the federal, interagency, so it had to get federal approval. And, on the one hand, the Biden administration moved very dutifully to get it done. On the other hand, there were points at which, like, other Biden agencies chimed in. Like, there's a huge, if you look at the environmental study, and this makes sense, right? The EPA had extensive comments, and those comments had to be addressed, and the environmental justice mitigations are largely an outgrowth of addressing the EPA's comments. And now, of course, there's the Trump DOT, which is coming at us with false facts about the program. So there are a lot of different interfaces among the agencies that I think are interesting.
Hi. First off, thank you for coming and welcome back to Cornell. Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned suing, I think, elected officials, if I understood correctly, and then later on working together. I can only presume that would be somewhat of a tense dynamic. I would love to hear more about that process and kind of what it was like to potentially kind of, I don't know if the relationship was damaged in suing them, but if it was, like how you could then move forward and work together.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. So that picture with the governor is taken before we sued her. So we then sued her, and then there are other pictures. I didn't have the picture from afterwards, but there are other pictures afterwards. I mean, working in politics way back, somebody said to me, no permanent enemies, no permanent friends. And I think that is relevant. And I think, there's a lot of self-preservation, here where people are sort of, they're looking after themselves. So that's part of it. I think that appraising the governor right now, she has been largely beneficial for transit. She's been more beneficial for transit than most governors. It's not perfect. If you ask people in the climate movement, there are people really, really angry with her right now, understandably. And again, it's this issue where, what's affordable, when, to whom, is driving her calculus, right? She's very afraid that people are going to say she's driving up their electric bills, and so she doesn't want to push them onto using even more electricity and less gas, especially when the president is subsidizing gas. But at the same time, electric bills are spiking. And she needs to figure out how to blame that on the president so that people don't blame her next year when she's up for re-election. And if she does that really effectively, then maybe she can raise them higher and people won't blame her.
Thanks for your talk. I'm Tom Campanella. I'm a 12th year professor of city and regional planning here. I grew up in what I call deep South Brooklyn.
Yes, I know your book.
A total transit desert. I'm 61. I'm pretty sure I'm not going to live to see the extension of the Utica Avenue line or the Flatbush Avenue line, which was supposed to go down to Floyd Bennett Field. I have advocated in my way for getting a stop on the ferry at either Canarsie and or Floyd Bennett Field or Mill Basin. I don't think that will happen, but it's more likely than the subway. Here's my question. As someone who's spent a lot of time in Asia and Hong Kong and in Tokyo and certain capital cities in Europe, I'm astonished at how primitive the gate and tolling system is with the New York City subway. I mean, it's the dumbest design I've ever seen. I ride the subway a lot. I'm often in the city, and it's dozens of people hopping over, hemorrhaging money from the system. We can't seem to do much about that except put like saw blades on the sides of the thing, which are ridiculous, and they do nothing. The other aspect of this is when you have a system like in Hong Kong or Tokyo, you get an enormous amount of data, mission critical data, by knowing point of origin, why can't we do that? What is the opposition to that in New York City?
Those are places where people tap out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we have that
in Washington
yeah,
too.
Right.
Right.
Plenty of systems that tap out. We have been building the system while we're flying it for over a century. Yeah. There has never been a point where it was properly maintained, right? It's always been undercapitalized. It's strange, right? I mean, we've not stopped, right? Part of being the 24/7 system at the same time as being a uniquely sprawling system for the U.S. context, I think, explains some of that. I do think the sawtooth, though, will cut down on fare evasion, but people are very upset about it. It's astonishing. But yeah, no, I think that it's funny. There are some Canarsie activists looking for a ferry stop. I think before that we could have a much faster bus on Utica Avenue to Kings Highway, to Kings Plaza. We could. The MTA. So to Tom's point, the MTA did this 20-year needs assessment before they produced their most recent capital program, and they estimated the cost of bringing the subway down Utica Avenue, which is a very heavily used bus route, at $17 billion. But they said they could do bus rapid transit for less than $1 billion. And so, I think there's an argument there. I know there are people in the governor's office even now who want to build more rail beyond what she's already promised. I think that's ambitious. And I think we shouldn't wait. I think the promise of better bus service is that it's something that we could have soon. And we need to keep improving and keep saving people time and money. I mean, part of the difficulty people have living in the city is just being so stretched. Time is money. We saw an analysis that bus rapid transit could save 17 minutes per trip on Utica Avenue. It's a ton of time.
Cool. Hi, Danny. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Matt, and I'm a first-year MRP student here. I just have you briefly mentioned Stockholm earlier in your presentation, amongst many other international cities. And conveniently this semester, I'm doing a project on Stockholm for our intro class. And let me know if you disagree with this statement, but Stockholm is anti-car because it is pro-environment, whereas New York City is pro-environment because it is anti-car, in a certain sense. But I was curious about how you think changing the ethos behind that. If New York City were to promote congestion relief as like an environmental concern rather than a productivity or economic concern, if you think that would help public opinion and alleviate these concerns, or I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, that's what Mike Bloomberg did, right? He tried exactly that, and it didn't work. I think there's many different things at play. One of the things that when you were the first part of your question brought up for me was that compared to other U.S. cities at least, right, we have a minority of people who commute by car into Manhattan, and so it's aggrieved. Right? It's embattled, right? Because they're trying to get me out of my car, right? No one in Houston is saying they're trying to get me out of my car. They're not. But there's an argument that people like me are trying to get them out of their car, and they get frustrated about it. It also happens to be that it's a relatively privileged group of folks, because most people have already stopped doing that or never saw an avenue to do that in the first place because they didn't have the means. They were struggling as it is. So, I think we're in the right place in a way with the governor and Mamdani, focusing on affordability, right? Because there is a real equity component to it. We don't always have to call it equity because there is acknowledgement that some people can afford their lifestyle much better than other people, that things are much more of a stretch. And the one thing where I think we're not cognizant enough, and this is why the bus stuff is so important, is we forget who we rely on, right? New York City is not just unimaginable without transit, it's unimaginable without millions of relatively low-wage workers, right? And if those folks can't get to work, everything stops. And we saw that with the pandemic. We acknowledged it for about 5 seconds, and then we moved back to our own selfishness. But we have to acknowledge that to make smart policy.
Hello, I'm a fourth year urban planning student, Franklin. Riders Alliance. I don't know much about the nonprofits in New York City or the people doing advocate work. I assume you guys have existed for at least, since 2019. That's when you put the thing up there. In terms of organizing a grassroots movement, obviously you've done a lot of work to, gain your 12 dozen or your dozen staff members and to get full-time employees onto the nonprofit, to have the capacity to actually carry out lawsuits and push forward on that front. What are the, in your hopes, what are the next stages for your nonprofit in terms of its capacity to grow or its next ways to restructure itself as an organization to perform better or advocate better?
So you reminded me I had a slide that I forgot about, so that's really helpful. One of the things I want to talk about, and we don't have to walk through this totally, but is that, so we're a part of now, during the pandemic, there was a threat to all transit across the country, so we stood up a national campaign for transit justice that we're still involved with, but it is largely led outside of New York City and by advocates from cities where they're a lot lonelier than we are in New York. We also now have a New Yorkers for Transportation Equity coalition, which we are very heavily invested in New York because so much of what we do runs through Albany, and Albany is looking at statewide policy, not just the MTA, even though the MTA dwarfs what is going on in transit in New York City, dwarfs what is going on in the rest of the state. There is a whole rest of the state, and it's important, and there are millions of people. So what we want to do with that is give people, and goes to the affordability point too, everyone in New York, in the city or elsewhere, should have options of how they get around and should be able to afford those options. And those options should be fast, frequent, and reliable, and safe, right? So that requires thinking about how we get, the bus that runs from Ithaca to Enfield to run more than once a day, right? That requires thinking about how to get some of the higher frequency and routes that are now once an hour, closer to once every 15 minutes, coming into many of the upstate cities. And we do that, to improve people's quality of life and make life, easier in many places in the state, but also to have a broader acknowledgement that the future of New York is transit dependent. And for when inevitably the MTA needs more money, to do what Tom is talking about, that we are able to go to Albany and not hear, oh, but we already gave you the money, what'd you do with it? Because, inevitably that money's gonna be gone at a certain point, and there will be more challenges. Every peer system around the world either has an enormous real property base that it sits on, or tremendous support from the national government, or both. We don't have either of those things. And we need to figure out alternatives, and the alternative is organizing, is solidarity.
I have a question. Obviously, Mamdani is running on the word affordability, and affordability has become a major issue across the country. California is under a lot of attack because a lot of laws that were well-intentioned have made housing expensive, et cetera. In terms of transit, when you mentioned accessibility, one of the debates around accessibility and affordability has been that if people who have mobility issues, need transit, it's less expensive to give them a van, for instance, that takes them directly where they want, than spend the money to install an elevator at 138th Street and whatever. Obviously, if the numbers are such that justify it, that's fine, but how do you balance these things, and where do you, either as an organization or even as an individual, figure out the balance between sort of pragmatics and ideals when it comes to these kinds of questions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the MTA has dealt with it in even sort of more granular things like, should you have to reserve the van far in advance? You know, it costs them more money if you don't, right? They had this on-demand e-hail pilot that they refused to expand beyond a certain number of very active people with disabilities, and that's been a bone of contention. We are at the scale, and also we're aging, for very, you know, in a lot of respects. We're at the scale where we need it to spend the money on accessibility, even if it weren't the law, because, you know, the estimate is 1 million New Yorkers don't climb stairs. So it's worth doing. And if you go to modern systems, they're all accessible, right? Like we're a laggard because we're so old and it's so hard to build for us. But yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, that challenge also comes up in other contexts, like should we run like micro transit? You know, should the MTA invest in tinier buses because like the routes in Staten Island, you know, aren't filling up, or the routes in Eastern Queens at the end of the night, you know, are not worth running a whole bus, and there's a lot of labor issues that get, you know, implicated there. There are a lot of places, small places, that have given up their transit and are, you know, subsidizing Ubers. Early on in this work, I went to a talk by a Rutgers professor, and he said, you know, the country is less dense now than it was in 1940, which is bad, I think. But, you know, you could argue many different things. But his point was like, it would be cheaper to give people, in terms of access to opportunity, where the access we're talking about is socioeconomic, giving people cars would be less expensive than really improving transit. I think it was mostly in the context of people commuting into coastal California from the Central Valley.
Hi, thank you. I was interested, I guess, kind of on the concept of affordability, but more from the perspective of like procurement and contracting for the MTA. Just knowing what I know about kind of it seems like there's a legacy of, at least currently, of cost overruns, and maybe it's improved in the past few years, but like, does the Riders Alliance kind of organize also around the issues of like improving the efficiency of, you know, capital improvements, or just like the general system overall, so we can have more transit?
So I think we build power, and we're at our most effective when we're describing the problem. So the problem is usually that we don't have fast, frequent, reliable, and accessible transit. But as we get into the details, one of the reasons is that, you know, we have incredibly high costs, and, you know, there's the notorious expose in the New York Times, the most expensive mile of subway, about the 3 subway stations that were opened under 2nd Avenue in 2016. That's bad. The extension to Hudson Yards is the 2nd most expensive mile of subway. They opened the new Long Island Railroad Terminal under Grand Central Terminal is more embarrassing than either of those things, you know, in terms of that stuff. And most of that is bad planning, not necessarily like bad labor practice or anything else. I think it's a problem because the people who are most interested in the status, it's a logic of collective action problem, right? There are a lot of people who are deeply invested in the status quo because they make money on it. And it's mostly not organized labor, it's mostly organized capital. It's mostly the owners of various consultancies and engineering firms and stuff like that. But it's everybody. And part of it is that these projects are each a unicorn, right? Because we don't build, so you have to like squeeze maximum, you know, rents out of every last one, as opposed to saying we're going to do what Paris does or what Shenzhen does and keep building, right? If we keep building, if we have the muscle memory, we could do more of it in-house and take out some of the profit motive. And we could also tell people, like, you have a career in building tunnels. You don't have to fund your entire pension with the one tunnel.
So it is 1:30, and because of Mr. Pearlstein's schedule,
Because of the bus schedule, we're going to end the main Zoom
and colloquium session now and move with a 30-second break into talk back in this room. So if you're interested in talk back and things like how Daniel made it from here to where he is and other questions like that, please stay and we'll have that conversation. And otherwise, let's give Nana thanks. Actually, it's a real chair. And it's a very sophisticated one. There you are.
Yes.
How did you make it from New York City to here?
Say that again.
How did you make it from from here to New York City?
You mean oh, for this trip? Or yeah, no, it's funny because I heard this like when I was 18 I came in my parents' Volvo, but now I took the hour bus, which is so it's funny, my parents now, they don't no longer drive and they take the hour bus to Ithaca too, which I didn't know until after I bought my ticket. I was like, oh, it's great, you approved it. It was amazing though because I live at the north end of Manhattan near the George Washington Bridge, and there were